Caroline and Brian's house, perched on a small hill in Boston, seemed to reflect their successful marriage. Their yard, enclosed by a white picket fence, featured rose bushes Brian had planted just last month, and through the living room window, you could see the bookshelf he had crafted by hand. Their photograph was proudly displayed at the center of family pictures arranged across an entire wall. Caroline Howard worked as a sales manager at a local real estate company, where she was highly trusted by her clients. Though gentle in nature, when it came to business, she demonstrated negotiation skills sharper than anyone else. 5 years into her marriage, life with Brian had been as happy as she had imagined. At least, that's what she had convinced herself. Mom's cooking this weekend and wants everyone to get together. Can you make it? Caroline asked her husband, taking a sip of coffee during their hectic morning before heading to work. Brian, who worked as a site supervisor at a local construction company, was valued for his meticulous nature and technical skills. Slightly taller than Caroline, his suntanned face exuded kindness. Of course. Elizabeth's cooking is the best in the world, he smiled, but his eyes wandered as if he were thinking about something. Will Vanessa be there too? Caroline frowned. Yes, my sister will be there. Why? No reason. I just saw her near one of our sites last week and wondered how she was doing. At Brian's words, Caroline paused momentarily. Something in his tone caught her attention, but glancing at the clock, she quickly picked up her bag. Let's meet at 6 then. Don't be late. Brian kissed her on the cheek and simply said, "Take care," before seeing her off at the door. In the car on her way to the office, Caroline reflected on Brian's behavior. Lately, she had begun to sense something off about his actions. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night and leave the house, or receive unexplained phone calls. Above all, she had noticed how his expression subtly changed whenever her sister Vanessa's name came up. Vanessa Griffin had grown into a beautiful, charming woman. However, she never settled into a stable job, and her relationships never lasted long. Caroline always worried about her sister. Since losing her husband 5 years ago, Elizabeth, their mother, had been living alone in a suburban house. Though she looked as gentle as Caroline on the outside, she was a woman with inner strength. She was a mother who devoted herself to her family, though sometimes her affection could feel burdensome. Caroline, do you have a moment? As she concentrated on work, her cell phone rang. It was her mother. Mom, what is it? I'm working right now. I'm sorry. I'm worried about Vanessa. Elizabeth's voice was lower and more somber than usual. She's been acting strange lately. She's wearing expensive clothes and jewelry, and I don't know where she's getting the money. Caroline sighed. Her sister's spending habits had always been a family concern. We're always worried about Vanessa. But she's an adult now. That's not it, her mother's voice suddenly grew stronger. This is serious. We need to do something. Let's talk on Saturday. Even after the call ended, her mother's words echoed in Caroline's mind. Though Elizabeth hadn't elaborated on what was serious, there was urgency in her tone. That evening, Caroline decided to talk to Brian about it. Hey, I got a call from Mom today, and she's worried about Vanessa. Brian suddenly sat up straight and looked away from the TV. Worried about what exactly? She didn't say much, just that there was some serious problem. Do you know anything about it? Me? Why would I know anything? His voice rose higher than usual. Because you always react like this whenever I mention Vanessa's name. Brian laughed as if making an excuse. I'm just tired. The site's been busy lately. That night, Caroline stared at the ceiling while listening to her husband's breathing. Something was clearly brewing within the family. Whatever it was, would it come to light at the weekend gathering? The next morning, barely 30 minutes after Caroline arrived at the office, she received a call from the police. Brian had been in a traffic accident on his way to work and had been taken to the city hospital. Her world changed in that moment. In the car on the way to the hospital, Caroline called Brian's cell phone repeatedly, but there was no answer. Her mind was in chaos, her heart pounding fiercely. Brian, always careful and a safe driver, getting into an accident. Something unusual must have happened. After parking at the city hospital, Caroline rushed to the reception desk. Brian Howard, he should have been brought in after a traffic accident, she said, out of breath. The receptionist replied with a kind expression. Mr. Howard is currently in surgery. Please wait in the third-floor waiting room. The doctor will explain once he's finished. Stepping into the elevator, she ran into a uniformed police officer. He asked, "Are you Mrs. Howard?" When she nodded, the officer adjusted his hat in his hands. "I was at the scene. I'll inform you about the accident circumstances." Caroline listened with bated breath. Brian had suddenly veered out of his lane at a normal intersection and crashed into a utility pole. Fortunately, it hadn't turned into a major accident involving other vehicles, but according to witnesses, Brian's car had been driving normally until it suddenly seemed to lose control. "We don't have the alcohol test results yet, but there was no smell of alcohol at the scene," the officer explained politely. "Ma'am, has your husband been troubled by anything recently?" Caroline momentarily recalled Brian's unnatural reaction last night but shook her head. "Not particularly." When she entered the waiting room, her mother Elizabeth was already seated there. With her gray hair neatly arranged and wearing her usual pearl necklace, she appeared surprisingly calm. "Mom, how?" Caroline was confused. "I only called you 10 minutes ago." Elizabeth smiled slightly. "Vanessa contacted me right away. She knew before you did." She took Caroline's hand. "It'll be all right, I'm sure." Those words should have been reassuring, but Caroline noticed her mother's eyes weren't smiling. She gave the impression of hiding something. "Where's Vanessa?" Caroline looked around. She was quite upset. "I told her to rest at home." Caroline felt doubtful, but just then, a doctor in a white coat entered the waiting room. "Are you Mr. Howard's family?" As both women stood up, the doctor explained the surgery results. Brian's injuries weren't life-threatening, just 2 broken ribs and abdominal bruising. However, the doctor's expression wasn't cheerful. "Mrs. Howard, drug traces have shown up in the blood tests," he said quietly. "They don't appear to be prescription medications." Caroline was at a loss for words. She couldn't imagine Brian using drugs. He was the type who only drank beer occasionally and strongly opposed drug use. "There must be some mistake," Caroline said with a trembling voice. "He's not the type to do such things." The doctor nodded understandingly. "The detailed test results will be available later, but a strong sedative has been detected. It's something that can't be obtained without a prescription." Caroline became even more confused. Elizabeth appeared shocked, but her reaction seemed somewhat theatrical. "Can I see him now?" Caroline asked. "Yes, but he's still under anesthesia and not fully conscious," the doctor answered. Room 203. On the way to the hospital room, Elizabeth placed her hand on Caroline's shoulder. "Go get some rest. I'll watch him. You haven't eaten anything since morning, have you?" Normally, Caroline would have followed her mother's advice, but something felt off. "Thank you, but I'm fine. I want to be by his side." Entering the room, Brian lay quietly with an oxygen mask and M4 drip. Despite the scrapes on his face, he looked like he was sleeping normally. Caroline took his hand and whispered, "It's okay, I'm here with you." Elizabeth stood by the window, looking outside. Suddenly, a notification sound came from her pocket. She quickly took out her phone and looked at the screen. In that instant, Caroline caught a glimpse of part of the message. It was from Vanessa, and the words, "It didn't work," were visible. Elizabeth hurriedly put the phone back in her pocket and said, "I'm going to the restroom," before leaving the room. Caroline felt her heart racing. What did "it didn't work" mean? Could it be related to Brian's accident? Yesterday's phone call from her mother, Brian's unnatural reaction, and today's accident, all seemed to form some kind of pattern. She gazed at Brian's face and whispered, "What's going on?" A nurse came in and changed the bag. "The anesthesia should be wearing off soon, so he'll probably wake up. But he might still be confused," she said kindly. Caroline nodded and continued to stroke Brian's hand. As time passed slowly, various thoughts swirled in her mind. The suspicious behavior of her sister and mother, the drugs detected in Brian's blood, her attempts to understand it all were leading her thoughts in a frightening direction. When Elizabeth returned, Caroline carefully observed her mother's expression. Today, unlike her usually unreadable face, anxiety and worry were visible. "Any word from Vanessa?" Caroline asked casually. Elizabeth seemed to freeze for a moment. "Yes, she's just worried." What did she mean by "it didn't work"? The color drained from Elizabeth's face. "What do you?" Just then, a groan came from the bed. Brian had regained consciousness. Caroline immediately went to his side and called out, "Brian. Can you hear me?" "It's me, Caroline." Brian slowly opened his eyes. His pupils were dilated and unfocused. "Caroline," he whispered weakly. "I tried to warn you." "About what?" "Brian, what happened?" But he lost consciousness again. As Caroline was about to call a nurse, the doctor entered the room. He had test results in his hand and wore a serious expression. "Mrs. Howard, we have more detailed test results," the doctor said quietly. "There's something I need to discuss with you about your husband's condition." The doctor gently placed his hand on Caroline's shoulder and also looked at Elizabeth. "Could we step out into the hallway for a more detailed conversation?" Caroline gazed at Brian for a moment, then stood up. "Mother, you stay here. I'll go hear what he has to say." She followed the doctor into the hallway. Under the bright lights permeated with the distinctive smell of hospital disinfectant, she tried to hide her trembling hands. "Mrs. Howard," the doctor said quietly, "the drug detected in your husband's blood is promethazole, a powerful sedative. It's typically prescribed for patients with severe anxiety disorders or schizophrenia." Caroline looked up. "But Brian doesn't have any such symptoms." "This is a mistake." The doctor shook his head. "That's not the only issue. There's evidence this drug has been in his system for an extended period. Not just once or twice, but signs of regular administration." Caroline felt her heart pounding fiercely. "Is that what caused the accident?" "It's highly likely. This drug causes strong drowsiness and impaired consciousness. If it took effect while driving." The doctor continued, choosing his words carefully. "Ma'am, this goes beyond a medical issue. The police have been notified, but this may not be just an accident, there's a possibility of intentional drug administration." The world began to spin before Caroline's eyes. Someone had been administering drugs to Brian. But who? Why? "Could I see more details?" she asked weakly. The doctor nodded and returned to the hospital room. Elizabeth was sitting in a chair slightly away from Brian's bed, nervously looking at her cell phone. When Caroline entered, she quickly put the phone back in her pocket. "How was it?" Elizabeth asked, deliberately changing her tone to sound worried. For the first time, Caroline saw through her mother's act. The doctor picked up Brian's hospital gown and approached the two women. "Mrs. Howard, please look at this," he said quietly, pointing to Brian's abdomen. Caroline gasped. There were multiple small injection marks on Brian's abdomen. Some were new, while others were clearly weeks old. Their regular placement indicated they weren't self-administered by an amateur. These are recent, but there are also traces of injections over a long period, the doctor continued, observing with a professional eye. This doesn't match the pattern of a typical drug user. It's likely these weren't self-administered. If he were doing it himself, the marks would be more irregular. Caroline was speechless. The scene before her eyes and the events since yesterday began to connect in her mind. Her mother's unnatural behavior, Brian's nervous reaction to mentions of Vanessa, and this morning's accident. Someone has been injecting him with drugs. Her voice trembled. The doctor nodded cautiously. Technically, it appears so. This is an opinion from a medical standpoint, but we should wait for the police investigation results. Just then, Brian's smartphone, placed by his pillow, suddenly began to ring. The name Vanessa was prominently displayed on the screen. Everything connected in an instant. Caroline observed her mother, who was standing away from the bed. Elizabeth was visibly agitated by the phone sound, her lips trembling. As the doctor's words faded away, Caroline silently picked up the phone and ended the call. Then she dialed another number. "What are you doing?" Elizabeth asked tensely. Ignoring her mother, Caroline coldly said to the person who answered, "Vanessa, I know everything you've done. Come to the hospital right now." After hanging up, a heavy silence filled the room. Elizabeth lost her color and tried to say something, but Caroline raised her hand to stop her. "Save your explanation until Vanessa arrives," her voice was ice cold. "Doctor, could you please leave us for a moment? This is a family matter." The doctor sensed the situation and nodded. "I'll be at the nurse's station. Call if you need anything." He left the room, quietly closing the door. Caroline turned her gaze to her mother. "Mom, why?" Elizabeth straightened her posture, suddenly seeming to regain her dignity. "What do you mean?" Enough with the act, Caroline tried to maintain her composure. "Brian has injection marks on his body, and drugs were detected in his blood. I saw Vanessa's message saying it didn't work. Her phone number is saved in Brian's phone. It all connects." Elizabeth remained silent, staring out the window. "You wouldn't understand." "Understand what?" "The reason for drugging my husband." Caroline's voice rose. "For what purpose?" There was no answer. Instead, there was a knock on the door, and Vanessa tentatively entered. Unlike her usual confident demeanor, she appeared small and withdrawn. Wearing an expensive designer jacket, she paused when she noticed the tense atmosphere between Caroline and Elizabeth. "What's happening?" she asked, pretending innocence. Caroline pointed to Brian lying on the bed. "Look at this." Vanessa reluctantly approached and saw the injection marks on Brian's abdomen. The color drained from her face. "I don't know anything." "Stop lying." Caroline's voice shook with anger. "I know what you and Mom did. You've been administering drugs to Brian, and it caused his accident. You sent Mom a message this morning saying it didn't work." "What didn't work?" "That you couldn't kill him." Vanessa took a step back and looked at Elizabeth. Her mother gave a slight nod. "No, Caroline," Vanessa said in a trembling voice. "We weren't trying to kill him, we were." Just then, a groan came from the bed. All three women turned to look at Brian. He was opening his eyes, trying to focus. "Caroline." He called out weakly. "Be careful, they are." Elizabeth hurried toward Brian's bed, but Caroline grabbed her mother's arm to stop her. "Don't touch him." At that moment, Brian reached out as if trying to convey something. Caroline grasped his hand and leaned closer. "Property, everything." His words were broken, but Caroline understood. He lost consciousness again, but it was enough. Caroline stood up and looked at her mother and sister. Anger and determination burned in her eyes. I'm calling the police. And a lawyer too. Wait. Vanessa cried out. Listen to us. We'll explain everything. Caroline scoffed. Explain. What is there to explain? Why you drugged my husband? That's not it, Elizabeth spoke up. Her voice was surprisingly calm. It was for you, Caroline. Everything was done to protect you. Caroline was confused. Protect me? From what? Elizabeth exchanged glances with Vanessa and nodded. It seems the time has come to tell the truth. The hospital room was shrouded in heavy silence. Outside the window, rain had begun to fall, and only the sound of raindrops hitting the glass broke the stillness. Caroline folded her arms and alternately looked at her mother and sister. If you're going to talk, do it now. Before the police arrive, she said coldly. Vanessa sat down in a chair and covered her face with her hands. It wasn't like that at first. She began in a trembling voice. We were just supposed to watch Brian. Watch him. For what purpose? Elizabeth stepped forward. Caroline, you've always been too trusting, her voice contained a hint of reproach. Since your father passed away, I've done everything to protect our family. Especially you. What does that have to do with me? Brian was suspicious from the beginning, Elizabeth continued. He approached you because he was after the Griffin family fortune. He wasn't the honest man you imagined him to be. Caroline shook her head. That's nonsense. Brian has never cared about my money. He takes pride in his work. On the surface, yes, Vanessa interrupted. But behind the scenes, he was a different man. Caroline turned to her sister. And you know this? How? Vanessa looked at her mother, appearing at a loss for an answer. Elizabeth sighed. I asked Vanessa to investigate him, Elizabeth quietly confessed. I had her get close to him. Men show faces to young, attractive women that they don't show to their wives. Caroline felt the truth gradually being revealed to her. You've tried to use Vanessa to seduce Brian. Her voice mixed shock and anger. Not seduce, Elizabeth emphasized. Just investigate. And our concerns were justified. Brian was. Lies. Caroline shouted. Brian isn't that kind of person. He was using drugs, Vanessa said quietly. I discovered it. Maybe it started recreationally, but it escalated. He became unstable. Caroline shook her head. But at the same time, she recalled Brian's strange recent behavior, sudden mood swings, and midnight outings. That still doesn't explain, Caroline said in a trembling voice. Even if he really was using drugs, why did you need to inject him? Vanessa and Elizabeth exchanged glances. At that moment, Caroline realized she wasn't being told the whole truth. It was to control him, wasn't it? Caroline suddenly understood. You were trying to control him and somehow keep him away from me. Elizabeth's expression changed. To protect you, she said earnestly. He was dangerous. He was after your money. He had been making plans. What evidence do you have? Caroline asked. The room fell silent again. Elizabeth and Vanessa seemed at a loss for words. You have no evidence, Caroline scoffed. It's all delusions. Ever since Dad died, Mom has been trying to control our lives. Especially mine. Elizabeth's face hardened. You don't understand. I was. What were you doing? Caroline raised her voice. Were you drugging my husband to protect me? And then caused his accident? Vanessa began to cry. The accident wasn't planned. She said in a shaking voice. It's just that he said he was going to tell you everything. Tell me what? Vanessa couldn't answer. Instead, Elizabeth spoke up. He had become aware of our treatment. And he threatened to tell you everything. And? Caroline pressed. When he woke up, we gave him a bit more medicine. Elizabeth continued, choosing her words carefully. Not enough to make him unable to drive, just enough to make him a little foggy. But what? He had been refusing to take the medication the day before, Vanessa said quietly. So it had a stronger effect than usual. Caroline was trembling with anger. So you intentionally overdosed him and caused his accident. That's not it. Elizabeth showed signs of panic. If he told you the truth, you would be hurt. We were just trying to protect our family. Family? Caroline laughed coldly. You call what you did for the sake of family. Your mother is right, Vanessa said, wiping away tears. I was against it at first. But Mom said she would pay off all my debts if... Debts? Caroline was surprised. Vanessa nodded shamefully. Gambling. I had a problem. Mom knew about it and helped me. But in return, she made you an accomplice, Caroline continued. And you agreed. Vanessa silently nodded. But the day before Brian's accident, he refused to take the drugs, Caroline connected the pieces. And he said he would tell Caroline everything. So Mom. Just then, the door opened, and 2 police officers entered. We received a report, the lead officer said. Suspicion of illegal drug administration and assault. Caroline turned and noticed the nurse call button beside the bed had been pressed. Had Brian regained consciousness and pressed the button? These 2, Caroline pointed at her mother and sister. They administered drugs to my husband and caused the accident. They just admitted it. Elizabeth turned pale. Caroline. We're family. Not anymore, Caroline said coldly. You are no longer my mother, and Vanessa is no longer my sister. If you talk about family, you are criminals who deceived me and tried to hurt my husband. The police officers approached Elizabeth and Vanessa and began reading them their rights. Elizabeth showed signs of resistance but eventually dropped her shoulders in resignation. Vanessa continued to cry quietly, her head bowed. Caroline returned to Brian's bed and took his hand. It's okay now, she said gently. The truth has come out. You're safe. His fingers moved slightly in her hand. Knowing it was his response, tears welled up in Caroline's eyes. Spring sunlight streamed through the windows of their new home in Boston's suburbs. Caroline stood in the kitchen, making coffee while gazing at the garden where tulips Brian had planted just last weekend swayed in the breeze. Several months had passed since the incident. Elizabeth was awaiting trial for drug administration and assault charges, while Vanessa had received probation as a result of a plea deal. Caroline and Brian had sold their old house and were starting anew in a new location. You're up early, Brian came downstairs and placed his hand on Caroline's shoulder. His complexion had improved, and his gentle smile had returned. Vanessa is coming today, so I was getting ready. Caroline turned and kissed her husband on the cheek. Brian picked up a coffee cup. Are you okay with that? He asked carefully. Caroline took a deep breath. I don't know. But I think it's worth trying. The doorbell rang, and Caroline opened the door. There stood Vanessa, thinner than before and without makeup. Instead of flashy clothes, she wore simple jeans and a sweater. Come in, Caroline said. There was no coldness, but neither was there the warmth of before. The 3 sat in the living room, and at first, an awkward silence prevailed. How's the treatment going? Brian started the conversation. Vanessa smiled faintly. It's going well. I attend gambling addiction meetings 3 times a week. And I'm also getting counseling for my codependent relationship with Mother. Caroline silently drank her coffee. Caroline, Vanessa seemed to need courage to call her sister's name. I'm truly sorry for hurting you. I won't make excuses. I was weak and running away from my problems. But now, I want to take responsibility for my actions. Caroline slowly raised her face. It's not easy to forgive, Vanessa. You and Mom nearly ruined my life. I understand, Vanessa's voice trembled. Just, give me time. I'll do anything to regain your trust. Caroline remained silent for a long while. It will take time to fully repair trust, she said quietly. But if you're truly reforming, I don't intend to close the door on repairing our relationship. Tears welled up in Vanessa's eyes. Thank you. That same weekend, Caroline had visited the state prison without telling her husband. The meeting with Elizabeth was brief and cold. But the color of regret Caroline saw in her mother's eyes for the first time lit a small flame of hope in her heart. A year later, a small gathering was held at Caroline and Brian's new home. Vanessa was there, proudly showing her one-year sobriety medal. In Caroline's hand was a letter from Elizabeth. Family isn't determined by blood alone, Caroline told Brian that evening as they stood in the garden. True family is a relationship of mutual respect and support. Brian took her hand, and they looked up at the starry sky. Wounds remained, but the healing process had begun. And time would heal the rest. It's a new beginning, Brian whispered. Caroline nodded. Yes, a new beginning.